welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and as you know, if you watch this show, it's political season, and so once again, we have a candidate with us tonight. But tonight we have a very special candidate running statewide. Our candidate tonight is Mike Frerich, candidate for state treasurer. Mike, thank you so much for being on the show.
Kevin, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thanks for having me.
Well, so the first thing that anyone has to ask, I think, about these state positions, I mean, this would even be true of governor, but people say, well, just what exactly does that position do? So what does the treasurer's job entail?
Well, that's a good question. I get it often on the campaign trail. People will say to me, I'm sorry, I don't know what the office does. And I said, that's okay. It's been a while since you took high school civics. The state treasurer is the chief investment officer for the state of Illinois. That means is we make investments for the state, but we also invest pooled assets for a bunch of municipalities around the state. The chief responsibilities are to make sure we have investments, to be in charge of financial literacy for the state, to be in charge of returning unclaimed property, and managing the state's 529 college savings plans are the main responsibilities of the treasurer.
So what is financial literacy and how do you manage that for the state?
Well, financial literacy is vaguely defined, and different treasurers have defined it in different ways. The job is to make sure that the people of the state have the financial skills to have strong family finances, because I think those are the bedrock of stable communities. And so for some treasurers, that meant we need to get into our high schools and make sure our students know how to manage their money. You know, too many students are graduating from high school, they go off to college, and they're met with a whole group of credit card companies ready to give them free credit cards.
And they take a lot of them.
And they take a lot of them, and they don't necessarily know how to manage them, and they find themselves a couple of years into college with a debt burden they can't manage. And so we need to make sure that our young people have the skills they need when they go out on their own to make responsible decisions. But then there are other people who are starting businesses who don't necessarily have a business background. Maybe their parents didn't teach them some of these skills, but we need to make sure that if they're going to grow their businesses and be successful, and people are going to keep their businesses open and keep their houses out there, that we help educate them. And so the state treasurer frequently works with other institutions. So we'll work with banks or work with various foundations to help provide some of this education, and the treasurer's office can help facilitate and advertise some of that.
So community colleges perhaps, or high schools, would you work with the State Board of Education, for example?
Yeah, I would look very much towards working with our schools for educating our young people. I currently serve in the Illinois State Senate, and I'm the chairman of the Senate Higher Education Committee. Higher education is important to me. I've seen what it can do to help open up opportunities for young people. Young people wouldn't necessarily have them. And so that's been one of my big passions serving in the state Senate. And I want to make sure that our young people are fiscally responsible and are able to go to college or community college or whatever they need to increase their opportunities.
So I'm actually a little bit surprised. I mean, I know about the treasurer's job really as the chief banker, essentially, of the state, and that all the money that's collected in taxes has to sit somewhere before it's spent on state expenses, right? So,
and hopefully when it's sitting there, it's earning some money for the state as well.
Should earn something, right? But I'm surprised by the educational component. That's something I had not realized. Is that something that's traditionally the role of treasurer, or is that something you want to bring to the office?
Different treasurers have played different roles in this. So Alexi Janulius, when he was treasurer, had a program, Smart Women, Smart Money. Went out to a lot of women-owned businesses, and helped give them the financial tools so they could be successful. You know, we've talked about going into schools to help out our young people, but also, you know, I really, as I just said, believe that strong home finances are the bedrock for having stable communities. And so we're going to go out and push forward smart families, smart money, making sure that families are making wise decisions. Because we've seen coming out of this global recession, a lot of people lost their houses. They got in over their heads. Sometimes that was banks or mortgage lenders sort of preying on certain communities, but we want to make sure they know what they're dealing with before they make some of these big life decisions.
But now the treasurer's office does not have any power of regulation. For example, you wouldn't be able to step in and have any kind of influence on what laws govern lending or consumer lending or mortgages or whatever, right? I mean, that's outside the purview of the office, correct?
You think of it, the General Assembly establishes the rules. When some bad actor breaks those rules, the Attorney General is in charge of prosecuting them. But I sort of think of this as being out ahead of the curve, and you hopefully stop people from making some bad decisions through good education.
Well, so let's talk about managing the money for a minute as well. So the state is broke, as everyone who watches the news knows. But that actually, that's really not something that the treasurer's office can affect, right? Because what you have to do is manage the money in the safest way possible, right?
Yes. So, but the one thing I'd say is I frequently am asked, why do you want to run for an office, be an investor of the state's money in a state that has no money? And I have to remind them, although our state's general revenue fund is low on funds and we have bills to pay, there are hundreds of state funds out there that have surpluses. And we also manage funds for municipalities around the state. And so there are funds there as well. And the state treasurer also has a spot on the Illinois State Board of Investment. And there are billions of dollars in assets there as well.
And I think there's a timing issue as well, right? I mean, tax revenues do come in regularly. And so that money sits somewhere and under your purview, under the treasurer's purview, but it has to be managed while it's there, right? And is that so? For those in the financial circle, the average maturity is very short, right? You keep the money for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and that's about it, right?
So the vast majority of our resources need to be very safe, and they need to be liquid, because money will come in, but we have a backlog of bills that need to be paid. But for some of those funds, money comes in, and they're building up balances for some future purpose.
So how hard is the job? I mean, as you read what in terms of managing the money, the state law has fairly tight restrictions on what can be done with the money. Mainly, it can only be invested in debt, right? And very safe debt, like government securities, treasury bills, other government agencies.
Highly rated corporate bonds.
Right. And the average return actually is very low because those instruments aren't paying a whole lot nowadays. So given the tight restrictions on what the investment choices are, how much flexibility does the office have? Doesn't it kind of run on autopilot, or at least run on auto law?
Well, the vast majority of the funds, yes, you have tight restrictions and they need to be very liquid. But when you're managing billions of dollars and you're managing pension funds, you're investing for the long term. And so I do think that you can look at longer term investments out there. And one of the things that I think was being underutilized is the General Assembly several years ago gave the treasurer the ability to invest in technology companies in the state, to invest in Illinois-based venture capital so that they could invest in Illinois technology companies, startup companies, to help them grow. And you can get a good return on investment from them. But also, when you are growing companies in the state and you're putting more people to work and you're creating wealth in the state, that drives more tax revenue into the state. As you get more tax revenue coming in, we're able to make investments in things like our schools and our infrastructure. And so that seems to be a wise investment. A few years ago, the General Assembly said this program is going well. They allowed up to 1% of state funds, so nothing too risky. Wanted to make sure our portfolio was sound, but said maybe we can go up to 3%. Our current treasurer hasn't taken advantage of that, and that's something that I think we need to explore.
Now, I think it's interesting, and I did read about the technology fund, and it struck me that this is at the opposite end of the spectrum from the safe government securities that the majority of them, or the vast majority of the money is invested in, because anyone who follows the financial markets knows that venture capital, which is essentially what you're talking about here, is amongst the riskiest investments that can be made, because the vast majority, 90% or maybe more than that, of venture capital investment ends up not really paying it back. And what happens is the big winners, you only get maybe 1 out of 10, 1 out of 20, but the big winners pay off all the losers. So that's a highly risky model, which is why in the private sector it's usually specific companies, venture capital firms that are familiar with it and know how to pick the likely winners, or at least they think they're likely. So it's kind of surprising. It's kind of a juxtaposition of very safe debt, and even though it's only 1% or 3%, it's amongst the riskiest investments that the private sector would make.
Well, we're not bringing people on to make these decisions on which companies to invest in. We invest in Illinois-based venture capital firms, and they then in turn invest. And so no, not every investment they make will pay off. Some of them will go bankrupt, but by and large, as you said, they will have some big winners that overall give a good return to the state.
Okay,
but
so you're investing in the venture capital firms,
Yes.
which is a different thing altogether.
It's different. There's an awful lot of talk about the state shouldn't be picking winners and losers out there.
Well, you're not.
We're hiring professionals. And there's also, even between the treasurer's office, we put up another firewall. We take some really smart people who have worked in this field before, who volunteer their time to the treasurer's office and say, we're going to help you pick good firms, so that there's no fear here that some company that gives money to a campaign then gets money invested in them. There are plenty of firewalls. That's the best way to do this.
And it's hard to imagine a venture capital firm that's risking its own money as well. Now, I take it the money that's invested in these venture capital firms is pooled with the venture capitalists' overall funds. Like they don't
Yes.
specifically target.
There's no specific state fund.
Right, and there's no specific company that receives state funds. It's an investment in the venture capital company that is focusing on Illinois companies, right?
Correct.
Okay, so the level of risk and the likelihood of political shenanigans seems to be greatly diminished by this diffusion, right?
Yes, and that's why I feel very comfortable that we should do this. But I think when we do invest in Illinois-based venture capital, they're more likely to invest in Illinois-based startups and companies. And when we do that, not only do we get that rate of return, we're also helping grow Illinois companies, which are going to hire more people in our state.
Which
when we
raises
hire more
tax
people
revenue.
in the state, which raises tax revenue, it's a win-win for the state of Illinois.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. But speaking of investments, your opponent in the race has raised a couple of issues, as all campaigns do.
Sure.
He's leveled charges against you. But one of them is from your time in Champaign as an auditor for an early retirement buyout plan for pensions that, according to your opponent, ended up costing an additional $2 million beyond, well, it's supposed to save money. It ended up costing money. New bonds had to be issued in order to cover the shortfall. What was that all about?
That was about politics, plain and simple, as a verifiable falsehood. I find when a campaign doesn't have a vision for themselves, when a campaign doesn't have issues that they want to talk about, they resort to name calling.
Well, so what's false about the story?
So what's false about it is he says that this was Mike Frerich's early retirement incentive program. You don't have to listen to Mike Frerich. You can listen to the Champaign County administrator who said that's not true. It was her proposal. She came to me and said, can you provide some analysis? So I sat down and I put together various options for the county board. That this is how much the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund is telling us it will cost you. If you, after people retire early, if you don't fill any of their positions, you will have savings and salary that can make money for the county. If you refill all those positions, the same salaries, you're going to lose money.
Sure.
That's the analysis I provided.
And that's kind of basic reasoning. If you take someone out and start paying a pension early, and you backfill it so you're paying now the salary and the pension, it's going to cost you
money.
Right.
I told the county board that and said, you'll have to manage it. The county auditor is not in charge of managing hiring, and so they filled some of the positions. They left some open. And then the second thing, a verifiable falsehood from the campaign, is they said it cost the county $3 million. It didn't. Once again, you don't have to trust Mike Frerich. You can trust the nonpartisan county administrator. And she said it didn't cost anywhere near that amount. She's been tracking this. And so my opponent's campaign has been engaging in these falsehoods. They're telling lies, basically, hoping to get me to respond to this, hoping that they can have a story that he said and then he said. But I've just asked all reporters looking into this, talk to the people involved. Talk to the other county board members who were on the county board at the time. I talked to two of them, a Democrat and a Republican, who both said this is revisionist history. But that's, I think, what turns a lot of people off from campaigns. I think most people would like us talking about the issues, what we're going to do with the office, what our vision is. They get turned off when they see a candidate just engaging in negative attacks. And normally those come later in the campaign. They come an awful lot earlier in this campaign.
Sadly, as anyone who's followed politics knows, negative campaigning has been shown through testing, real-world testing, experimental testing, to actually be effective. And it's a sad truth, and as someone who has run for public office myself, I wish it were not true. But it's the nature of American politics. But coming back to the particular issues, something else that was mentioned that I think is intriguing, and I don't know whether this is really a position or if you had it or still hold it, but when you're talking about the state considering divestment from Israel because of the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians right now. I mean, did you really say that? Did it really happen? Do you really believe that?
Once again, another complete falsehood from my opponent's campaign. His campaign manager even revealed to my campaign manager after hours that that wasn't a real issue. I have been saying in the course of this campaign that we need to make greater investments in the state of Illinois. And I was referring to those technology funds. We need to be putting more money into those, more investment in Illinois companies.
And if that means bringing investment away from some other places that it has historically been.
But it doesn't. It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to take away from the Israel bonds. The other thing I've been talking about is I've said when the treasurer sits on the Illinois State Board of Investment, is in charge of managing our state's pension funds. You know, we should be looking at companies that make investments in Illinois as opposed to companies that shut down factories in Illinois and send those jobs to Mexico or to China.
Or go through tax inversions and move their headquarters overseas.
Or that. My opponent came out and said, we just need to look at the bottom line. how much return we're going to get. Well, I just have to say that if a company can make a few extra pennies for each of their shareholders by closing down a factory and laying off people in Illinois and shipping them overseas, that's not an investment we should be making. That is not a good investment for the state of Illinois. He chose to say that you just look at the bottom line. And so they chose to distract from this by saying that I want to divest from Israel bonds. I've never said that. They can't find me on record saying that anywhere. But once again, this is this political season, and some campaigns choose to come out and talk about what it is they want to do. And I've put it on my website. Lots of issues, things that I think we should be doing in the state. My opponent's campaign, if you look at his website, you'll find lots of attacks on Mike Frerich's. I think it's probably a sign of desperation.
Well, so speaking of coming back to investments then, the idea, and this has gained a lot of currency even in the for-profit world, the idea of having constituents outside of, like in a corporation, you have constituents outside of the stockholders. You know, they're the stakeholders, as they call them. So that's the community you operate in, it's the customers you serve. And in government, and I'll voice my own opinion on this, there is a...
It's your show.
It's my show. I am allowed to do that. That's why I get away with it. There is a distinction between thoughts about government being completely business focused, that the theory is we should run it like a business. And, you know, I have been in business for many years myself and understand what that means. But from what I believe I'm hearing from you, and stop me if I'm paraphrasing incorrectly, the government has a different role, and that the bottom line is not, although it needs to be respected, it is not necessarily the driving force.
No, I think we need to look at the bottom line, but we need to look at not just what the company says we're paying its shareholders, but we need to look at other ancillary dividends out there. And so if
non-monetary dividends.
Yeah, or monetary, like investing in Illinois-based companies, and Illinois entrepreneurs and small businesses, we can get a return on investment from them. And if an investment had a similar rate of return, but it put people to work in Texas or Mexico or China, well, that seems easy to me that we'd invest in the Illinois-based company. We're not saying that we're going to throw all interest out of consideration, only invest in Illinois. We need to remain diversified. However, when we have opportunities to invest in Illinois and get a rate of return and put more people to work and grow companies here, those are the other dividends that are paid off that we should consider.
Well, I'm glad you used the term dividends, because if we think about it, you can actually make a cost-benefit, a longer-term cost-benefit analysis, instead of just the short-term rate of return on an immediate rate of return on an investment. It's the long-term payoff, which is a real monetary figure, as you just pointed out, right? That counts in the overall economy of the state.
Well, and I think that's a problem sometimes with some corporations. They provide incentives to their CEOs that are just based on stock price. And there's certain things you can do to increase your stock price in the short term. And if you have an opportunity to cash out, maybe you might do that. But I think that corporations should be looking towards the long term if they're going to be around for a while, making investments that are going to pay off long returns. And definitely that's what we should be looking at the state of Illinois. You know, that I intend to be around here for a while. I've got a daughter who's 5 years old. I intend for her to be around here for a while. And we shouldn't just be looking at the quick buck. We should be looking at a safe investment that pays a return, but also improves our state for the long run.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the Treasurer's Office also helps to manage the pension funds, which, again, anyone who follows the news knows are in terrible shape. They've been underfunded for years and years.
That is true.
So essentially the pension deficit is in the many billions of dollars. What effect or what influence does the Treasurer's Office have on this debate about how to handle that situation?
Well, I'd say there are two things. The Treasurer does not set the rules on pension benefits or what goes into it. But the Treasurer has a bully pulpit and can talk to the legislature about what they ought to be doing. Now, my opponent, when he's been in the General Assembly, has voted for things like this pension ramp that even the Sun-Times said cost the state billions and billions of dollars. He voted for Rod Blagojevich's pension borrowing obligation bonds out there. They cost the state money. But now he's found religion and says that we need to make sure we make our payments into the pension system. And I don't care if you arrive late to this, you ought to do that. So you can use that bully pulpit. But then two, I think if we make smart investments with our pension funds and that we help grow companies here in the state of Illinois and don't really reward companies that are shutting down factories here and moving out, you can help grow our economy. And when we grow our economy, when we put more people to work, we get more money coming into the state in terms of tax dollars. We can then help pay down our pension obligations faster or make other investments in things like our schools and our roads and our public safety.
Now, with the pension funds, are there different investment rules? So for pension fund, most pension funds, I know people's 401ks and the like, which are essentially like pension funds, can invest in stocks
Yes.
and in other, well, more
Various
risky than
instruments.
bonds,
Yeah.
right? So as a manager of the, well, and I'm not sure how much the Treasurer's Office actually manages the pension funds.
The Treasurer's Office does not manage the pension funds. If we
Okay.
want, for people who care about this stuff, I'm hoping not to put anyone to sleep today, but there are 5 different state pension funds. There is the Teachers Retirement System, which is the largest. That has its own board that manages their funds.
And they're well funded, by the way.
The Teacher Retirement System, they are also a state puts money in, and they're not in great shape.
Okay.
There's a State University Retirement System. They have their own board of managers. But then the other 3 are included in the Illinois State Board of Investment. And the treasurer has a seat at the table there.
Gotcha.
The treasurer does not manage those funds, but has a voice. And it'd be nice to have a voice at the table speaking up for Illinois companies and speaking up for our citizens and our taxpayers.
So you mentioned vision. Now that I've straightened out what the pension funds
So
are.
let me just say, though, the treasurer is not the only person on that board. There are other people looking out for it, but I've just tried to outline my vision.
Well, I'm glad you clarified that too, because the pension funds being one of the biggest problems in Illinois, I'm sure people are curious about, well, gee, what are you going to do about the pension funds? And the answer is, well, you have some influence, but you don't get to call the shots, correct?
Yeah, the treasurer doesn't get to call those shots. And quite frankly, right now, the ball seems to be in the court of the Illinois Supreme Court. Pun not intended.
Yeah.
So the Supreme Court has a case in front of it about recent changes to the pension system and benefits passed by the Illinois General Assembly. And I think they had a ruling last month that made it pretty clear that they might strike down at least large portions of those benefits. And so the General Assembly
The cuts and benefits.
Yeah, the cuts and benefits. Right. The General Assembly will have to come back and see where we can go from here. But I think most people are waiting to see what kind of direction the Supreme Court gives. There's no use passing another bill without any sort of guidance from the Supreme Court.
Right, which is reasonable. You got to know what's going to pass muster.
Yeah.
Right? So you've talked a little bit about your vision for the office, particularly the education, the public service part. So besides education, public service, and managing the funds in a responsible manner, what do you see as the role, and what is your vision, and why are you running for the position?
Well, I'm running for state treasurer because I think there are good things we can do with this office to help grow our economy, to help put people to work, so we can make needed investments in our education. I'm the only candidate in this race that has the financial experience to do the job. Before I served in the Senate,
Having been an auditor.
yeah, I was a Champaign County auditor. I'm a certified public finance officer through the Government Finance Officers Association. My opponent is an attorney, and he made it clear for about 5 months that he wanted to run for Attorney General. And he told everyone for about 5 months he was running for Attorney General until Lisa Madigan announced she was running for re-election. Then he said publicly he wanted to stay minority leader, until I think his caucus maybe didn't want him to stay any longer. And then his third choice was state treasurer. This is the only office I wanted to run for. I want to run for it because I think I have a skill set. I'm the only candidate with a skill set to come in and clean up the office, to bring the needed transparency and reform so that we can make investments in our middle class and grow our economy.
So you've mentioned cleanup. So where is that? What needs to be cleaned up?
Well, I think we've seen this year, unfortunately, too many Illinoisans are disappointed in their elected officials. And you've seen some scandals and accusations come out of the treasurer's office. And I can't comment on all of those, but you have seen reports that you saw a huge increase in the number of internships, paid internships in this office. And that
Friends and Family Employment Act?
well, the Sun-Times reported that politicians were asked to provide recommendations, and children of large donors were given these paid internships. And that's troubling to me. You know, one, I think you've seen you don't need to have that number of interns out there. Previous treasurers have not done anything like this. And it looked to be a paid political army to help set up a run for governor.
Patronage in Illinois? I'm shocked.
Yes.
Shocked.
So that's disappointing, and how those jobs were filled is disappointing. I want to come in and on day one, conduct an audit to bring some talent from the state of Illinois to come in and tell us where the problems are, where we can remove some of the politics, where we can be more efficient in the office, and then clean up this office and run it in a professional manner.
Just out of curiosity, is the office headquartered in Springfield, or is it in Chicago, or are they both?
There are offices in Springfield and Chicago.
So when you talk about an audit, having been an auditor. I mean, classic audit is you come in and you look at all the numbers and you look for possible discrepancies or flaws in the accounting methodology. But is that what you're talking about when you talk about coming in and auditing the office, or are you talking about like an audit of workflow or audit of people's skills, or what?
Yeah, we want to make sure that the service we're providing, we're doing it in an efficient manner, and that we're providing the services that we, people of Illinois, come to expect. And so there's been an awful lot of talk of consolidating the treasurer's and the comptroller's office. Well, that would require a constitutional amendment, and that's not going to be on the ballot this year. But I've said, rather than talking about that constitutional amendment, what can we do now? When I come in, no matter who is elected state comptroller, I plan to sit down and say, where can we find efficiencies? Where can we work together? Where can we save the taxpayers of Illinois money? And that doesn't require a constitutional amendment. What it requires is an attitude that I'm willing to work together. And that's not necessarily my fiefdom. It's the office of the people of the state of Illinois, and we should all work together to improve it.
So I'm going to put you on the spot, and I know this is unfair, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Do you have a sense for how much, someone recently asked me the question, how much inefficiency do I think exists in government entities as a whole? How much waste is there in terms of if they were really the most efficient they could be, you know, how much would it cost compared to what it costs today? And I gave him some, well, I gave him a number. So if you were thinking about that question, maybe government general, well, Illinois government generally, but specifically the Treasurer's Office, could you put a percentage on what you think the inefficiency is?
Well, that's why we're going to come in, and we're going to bring experts to audit this office. I mean, I think the first place you can look is this paid internship program. I mean, we spent
but that's not going to be a whole lot of
hundreds
money.
of thousands of dollars. And so in terms of the overall state budget, no, $300,000 is not a big deal. But to the average Illinoisan, they see that paying $300,000, $350,000 to put the children of politicians and donors to work, well, that's
At the taxpayer expense.
An inefficiency that they would like to see removed. And so we're going to start there, and we're going to do other things. And we're not going to do this just at my recommendation. Well, like I said, we're going to bring in experts to conduct an audit and to help us sort through some of this.
So is this kind of your first 100 days plan? You're going to get this audit in place? And how long do you expect that to happen, and when might we start to see payoffs from that?
Well, I think with any audit, you start discovering things right away, and I intend to be involved early with this. But some of these are going to take some time, and so I don't want to get people's hopes up with any specific timeline, but we're going to get to work on day one and start this process going forward.
So let's say you're elected, and it's now 4 years later, and you're looking at your first term. What do you want to be able to say about your first 4 years?
Well, I want to say that we came in, we cleaned up the office, we ran it professionally, that there are no charges of politics playing a role in decisions in the office, and that we made investments in our citizens, and our entrepreneurs, and our small businesses that help grow business here in the state of Illinois, that put people to work.
Will you be able to measure that? I mean, is there a way you could measure whether your actions have a real effect on the economy? I mean, a hard number?
Well, the economy is driven by so many different factors. It's hard to claim credit. But you know that the people who come, if they're able to get access to capital, that they're not able to right now, and they're able to grow their business, hire people in their communities, then you'll be able to tell stories about that. You'll be able to point to examples, and it's not necessarily about who gets credit for this. It's about the fact that Illinois is going in the right direction. And if Illinois is going in the right direction, that's reward enough.
Well, Mike, we're already out of time. So I hope 4 years from now you'll come back with some of those stories and be able to tell us about your successes.
I'll be happy to come back before 4 years are out, if you'll have me.
I would be happy to. Thank you so much for being my guest tonight. Thank you for watching us here on Public Perspective. Our guest tonight has been Mike Frerich. He's running for state treasurer in November, so please get out and vote on November 4th. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You've been watching Public Perspective. You can see us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19 and find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.